This innocent picture shows Jane Greer, aged just 18, posing for Life magazine, modeling the latest uniforms for the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps during World War II. She was unknown and uncredited for this fun job, which she landed due to her mother's role working for the War Department. Given the formal and military nature, it seems unimaginable that this photo could lead to not only a brilliant Hollywood career, but also a dark and twisted real-life noir story involving one of the most powerful men in the world. And yet, that's exactly what happened. Just 5 years later, Jane Greer was one of the most desired women on the silver screen, and her femme fatale status was about to become all too real. This is the mysterious story of Jane Greer, and Hollywood's real-life film noir thriller. Welcome to Hollywood Mysteries. Betty Jane Greer and her twin brother Dunn were born in Washington, D.C. on September 9, 1924. They were the only children of Charles and Betty Jane Greer. The name of her brother was a reference to the celebrated English poet, John Donne, from whom the family were descended. Their father, Charles, worked as a salesman, and he switched between peddling a whole variety of consumer products, including everything from oil burners to fire extinguishers, with the latter maybe a wise pairing for the former. He was forced to change jobs every few months due to a general lack of interest. In the meantime, he devoted much of his time to inventing, which was his real dream. He spent his spare time working on an onion peeler that he hoped would revolutionize, onion peeling across America. But it never caught on. His frequent job changes meant the family fell into plenty of financial difficulties, particularly during the Great Depression. At times, the Greer family were hit by severe food shortages and went hungry. Mrs. Greer often gave her children pennies to buy lemon-flavored hard candies, which many Depression-era kids knew was a traditional remedy to alleviate hunger. But as far as nutrition goes, they weren't going to help much. Betty Jane Greer, Betty Jane Sr. that is, had always dreamed of a career in the arts, but her family did not support her ambitions. She came closest to realizing this dream through her poetry, and several of her works appeared in anthologies. From 1932 to 1934, she also wrote the Aunt Bertie's column for the newspaper in Sarasota, Florida. These unfulfilled poetic aspirations led her to hope that her children would pursue artistic careers. Jane, in particular, became the realization of her mother's dreams. But it wouldn't be poetry that launched her to artistic fame. In fact, the path she would take would be defined by her thrilling beauty. Throughout her childhood, Jane participated in talent contests and many beauty pageants. Although she never won any contests, she began professional modeling at the age of 12. She recounted, "Mother was undaunted. She was never guilty of pushing me. I rather enjoyed all the attention at that age." While attending Western High School in Washington, Betty Jane Jr. became involved in the Dramatics Club, eventually serving as its president. It was during this time that 15-year-old Betty Jane also faced her first major life crisis. "I'll never forget that night," she remembered later. "It was a big evening. My crush, a 17-year-old high school boy who delivered our daily newspaper, had deigned to attend the party. He liked my dress. It was black, my first black dress, and almost off the shoulder. Suddenly, for no apparent reason at all, he looked at me so strangely. 'What's the matter?' I asked him. He replied, 'Why are you making such a funny face?' 'Oh, I always look this way,' I quipped. What was the matter with him? Was my lipstick smudged or something? I walked to a mirror and screamed. My left eye was bloodshot and watering. My mouth, slack-jawed, gaped open. The left side of my face was distorted in a Frankenstein grin. I cried myself to sleep that night, sleep which only came when my hand pushed down the left eye to close it. I woke up the next morning with one side of my face completely paralyzed." Doctors diagnosed Jane's condition as Bell's palsy, a neurological disorder from which few people fully recover. Nevertheless, she was determined to overcome it. She explained, "I rented a heat lamp, had it on and off a few minutes at a time for a month. I held a hot water bottle to my face all day and night long. I tried to feel, to see. One side of my face felt numb, but I kept moving it. It took me months, just trying to make it go up to match the other side. Then one day it went up 1/8 of an inch, just a flicker, but the doctor knew that the muscle wasn't completely dead, and I knew I could do it. For hours at a time, I'd say, ah, and study my jaws. They had to be exactly even, and finally they were. Then I went to work on my left eye. I had to open and close it with my fingertips. With encouragement from her mother, Jane started to see her demanding rehabilitation as an opportunity. I'd always wanted to be an actress, and suddenly I knew that learning to control my facial muscles was one of the best assets I could have as a performer. Emotions often must be portrayed from an inner feeling, of course, but I had a double advantage, because I was learning to direct my as-yet expressionless feelings, as well as gaining an ability to express emotion by very conscious manipulation of my muscles. After taking 2 months off from school, Jane returned to her studies, but she found herself feeling defensive and withdrawn. She feared her classmates would reject her due to her facial condition. Before leaving for school each day, she had to lift the left corner of her mouth into a smile. However, this strange and unpleasant ritual inadvertently gave her a unique trademark. Jane's condition resulted in what was described as a calm, quizzical gaze and an enigmatic expression. Her palsy left her with a unique look that defined her. This look would later lead RKO to promote her as the woman with the Mona Lisa smile. Along with her distinctive features and deep, resonant voice, Jane's unusual demeanor contributed to her development as a femme fatale in the making. Jane did not complete her high school education. Financial difficulties continued to plague the Greer family, and she decided to leave school during her senior year. She felt she could begin to pursue a life on the stage, but it would be music and not acting, which would draw her in. She took a job with the Ralph Hawkins Band, earning an impressive salary of $100 a week. After that, she auditioned for Enrique Madriguera's orchestra, which had recently been hired to perform at Washington's Club del Rio. Madriguera's orchestra was well known for its elegant society music and carefully arranged Latin American tunes. Jane sang the Spanish songs with her rich, deep voice, although she later admitted that she had learned the words phonetically and did not fully understand their meaning. And the band were teasing her about it. She said, "Later I discovered some of the words were not as written. His band was putting me on." Jane remained with Madriguera for around 8 months, during which she also participated in his nightly radio show. By 1942, America was deeply embroiled in World War II, and Betty Jane Sr. had secured a minor position in the War Department. When she found out that the newly established Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was looking for models to showcase their new uniforms, she recommended her daughter for the job. This opportunity was a stepping stone for Jane in her long-sought acting career. She appeared in a recruiting poster, and later in the photo spread in Life magazine's June 8, 1942 issue, which we showed you at the start of the video. From here, things would take a surprising and stunning upward turn in her life. Jane also modeled the WAC uniform for a segment in a Paramount newsreel. This was major exposure, but the reason she was chosen was somewhat mundane. She explained, "The reason I was given the close-up of the WAC cap was that it was raining. I pinned up my limp hair into a bun at the neck. An officer found a regulation stipulating the hair should be 1 inch off the collar, so they chose me for the close-ups. The other 2 models had permanents which were unperturbed by the weather." After the newsreel was spotted by Paramount's talent department, they invited Jane for a screen test related to a potential studio competition. Although she thought her audition was, quote, awful, they signed her to a contract, although it was one that she painfully misunderstood. It was not a definitive agreement, but rather an option that the studio could choose to cancel within 30 days. Betty Jane and her mother, however, believed they were signed up and on to the path to Hollywood, and they celebrated with several going-away parties. While waiting for their plane tickets, Jane received a letter from the studio stating simply, "Sorry, we have so many of your type." Embarrassed, Jane retreated to Washington where, quote, "immediate seclusion was my goal." However, her family encouraged her to confront the situation head-on and not give up. She decided to tell her friends that her attorney advised her not to sign the Paramount contract as a means of saving face and softening the embarrassment. In the meantime, Jane's exposure in Life magazine and the newsreel caught the attention of the public, especially Rudy Vallee. The 41-year-old crooner, well known for his romantic escapades, noticed Jane in her WAC uniform and used his connections to obtain her phone number, which he called at the Greer family's Washington apartment. Betty Jane Sr. answered, and he told her that he saw potential in her for the film industry and offered to help her pursue a movie career in Hollywood. While Jane and her mother were flattered by Valley's attention, Mom firmly told him since Jane was still a minor and under her mother's strict supervision, they would have to decline his offer. It was apparent from the seemingly innocent call that Valley was interested in a little more than helping out Jane's career. Nonetheless, he stuck to his plan and used his connections to once again spread the word about the WAC girl. Months later, Jane was given another chance when David O. Selznick arranged for her to be tested in New York. This time, the screen test was successful, and it was photographed by Stanley Cortez. Once the test made its way to California, Freddie Schuessler, the casting director for both Selznick and Howard Hughes, discovered that Selznick was not very impressed with the footage. Schuessler then showed it to Hughes, who had a very different view. He was mesmerized by Greer, and he immediately instructed one of his talent scouts in New York to travel to Washington and take photos of Jane. The photos were taken without makeup and were unretouched, but that was all Hughes needed to see. Hughes ultimately signed Jane to a contract with options that expired every 30 days. The final contract was signed about 6 months after Jane arrived in California. Jane and her mother arrived in Hollywood in early 1943. They were soon introduced to Howard Hughes's well-known protégés, Jane Russell and Faith Domergue. Following standard procedures, Jane began a series of coaching sessions to prepare for her film career. These sessions included drama lessons with Florence Enright, along with training in coordination and poise. Jane found Hughes to be a very friendly employer. He charmed all of us and performed many kind acts, she remembered. What fascinated Jane even more than Hughes's high-profile mentorship of Russell and Domergue was the fact that there was also 20 other girls under personal contracts with Hughes. She said, the drama coach, Florence Enright, whom Hughes used, would have us leave on the half hour so we would avoid meeting each other. You can imagine how curious we were. Finally, I couldn't stand it and hid behind a bush across from the bus stop and managed to glimpse a dark-haired beauty entering her home. Soon after, Jane was invited to audition for Hughes himself. He typically asked new girls to read scenes from the script of The Awful Truth. Jane memorized the lines, and when she entered Hughes's impressive office, she was ready to impress. In a 1947 article, Life described her audition for Hughes. She prepared for her first interview with Mr. Hughes by carefully learning the script with which she had heard he tested all aspiring stars. It was a comedy, The Awful Truth, and because Howard Hughes is a little deaf, Miss Greer read it at the top of her lungs. Hughes was impressed for various reasons, not least her thoughtful decision to bellow the lines at him, and decided to change her option into a formal contract. With her future now secure, Jane's father, Dunn, and their family dog, Ripley, joined her and Mrs. Greer in Hollywood, where they rented a house. This was when media speculation about Hughes being her new romantic interest really blew up. But Jane and the eccentric entrepreneur only went on one official date. Hughes took her to an amusement park, but Jane noted that he spent more time, quote, throwing baseballs at glass bottles and riding rides than interacting with her. She concluded that he was far from the ideal date. In an interview with comedian and talk show host Skip E. Lowe, Jane had plenty to say about Hughes's character. She explained that his awkwardness during their date stemmed from the fact that he, as she put it, really had no childhood. Instead of being the suave figure often depicted in the media, she described him as vulnerable and insecure. Jane's former protector, Rudy Valley, was still actively involved in her life. In fact, by now, Rudy was the only thing in her life apart from the controlling Hughes. He recalled, Hughes forbade her to go out in public, but she remembered the phone call and was soon singing at some of my Coast Guard band appearances. A more charming, talented, and gracious person I shall never know. A romance blossomed between Jane and Valley. On December 2, 1943, they married at the Hollywood Westwood Community Chapel. The wedding was full of military flair, with the couple passing through an arch of crossed sabers held by Coast Guard personnel. The marriage surprised many, as Jane was an ingenue who had yet to star in a film, while Valley was known as Hollywood's most notorious vagabond lover. Hughes, on the other hand, was not so much surprised as in a fury. While they celebrated their marriage with a honeymoon at a desert resort, a sinister hand was plotting to sabotage Jane's career before it even began. Though Jane appeared to embrace her role as a devoted wife, she likely had a few doubts about settling into a domestic life with Valley before she had managed to make an impression on the silver screen. He nonetheless introduced her to the lavish lifestyle of living in a 20-room home in San Fernando Valley, a home previously owned by Anne Harding. He even designed stylish black-on-black and bright pink satin outfits for her to match the interior decor. He seemed to have found the woman he wanted to settle down with at last, but this doll in a dollhouse fantasy would, unsurprisingly, soon falter. In March 1944, Jane and Rudy separated for the second time. The aspiring actress expressed that they were happier living apart than together. By June of that year, they had ended their relationship for good. Jane explained, "There's something about the possessiveness of marriage that won't work for us." However, physically separating from Valley and moving on were two different issues for her. In September 1944, just 3 months after their divorce, Jane seemed to have had a change of heart when she told the media, "Rudy is the only one for me. Our marriage will last forever now. Our divorce has brought us closer together than ever." Unfortunately, her youthful optimism did not hold true, as they stopped dating once and for all, and Valley eventually married for a fourth time in 1949 to Eleanor Kathleen Norris. Meanwhile, Jane was under contract with Howard Hughes from January 1943 until mid-1944. During this time, she realized that waiting for even a small role to materialize could take years. And with Hughes bitterly resentful towards her over her marriage to Rudy, even small roles would be hard to come by. She realized Hughes did have a weakness: money. This led her to buy out her agreement with Hughes for $7,572. The story goes that budget-conscious Jane had initially paid Hughes 2 weekly installments of $25 each. Then she decided that since he was so much wealthier than she was, it was pointless to continue these repayments. Later, Hughes confessed that he never expected to receive any refund at all and only agreed the deal as a formality. Following this liberation, Jane joined RKO Pictures, where she found herself finally free from Hughes's control. At the time, it was rumored that she managed to sign with RKO thanks to one of Valley's many connections in the industry, having helped convince Hughes to let her go as well as convince RKO to give her a shot. RKO was thriving during the prosperous World War II film era and had a large roster of contract players. Most of these were lower-tier actors used economically to fill roles in the various productions the studio was churning out. Although Jane did not land any feature roles right away, she participated in drama coaching with Lillian Albertson and took singing lessons with Robert Keith. Jane stepped in front of the RKO cameras for her film debut in early August 1944. She appeared in 2 O'Clock Courage, which premiered at the Rialto Theater on March 13, 1945. This movie was part of a double feature, and one reviewer remarked that it has less guts than its title. The film itself was a dull murder mystery, starring Tom Conway as an amnesia victim accused of killing a Broadway producer. Unfortunately, her small part did not much impress either critics or audiences. When Jane saw herself on screen for the first time, her reaction was also rather critical. She said, "My mouth was much too large. My eyes turned out and my legs were toothpicks. Aside from that, I was numb." Her next film, Pan Americana, debuted at Lowe's State Theater on March 22, 1945. This was yet another RKO musical, but one that lacked any real excitement. Its only unique aspect was the inclusion of actual Latin American actors, which was uncommon at the time. Jane appeared briefly in one of the production numbers and delivered a short line of dialogue. "Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am." Then, in a dressing room scene, she exchanged snide glances with her fellow dancers. This did not provide much of a start for someone on a $100 a week contract. The third film Jane worked on that year was George White's Scandals, a low-budget musical that largely wasted the talents of Joan Davis and Jack Haley. Aside from their satirical number, Who Killed Vaudeville, Jane played Billy Randall, a clumsy dancer who had her heart set on the show's director, Philip Terry, even though she knew he was pursuing Martha Holliday, a British socialite trying to prove her worth as a ballet dancer. In line with the film's low aspirations, Jane's character got her comeuppance when a bucket of paint was dumped over her head. Jane's entry into RKO's economy series filmmaking came with Dick Tracy, the first of 4 films based on Chester Gould's famous cartoon detective. Although Jane had limited screen time compared to the leading lady, Anne Jeffreys, she infused her character with more depth and personality, and the film was her first hit. Now earning a bump salary of $200 a week at RKO, Jane also stayed busy posing for the studio's publicity department. One photo shoot depicted her as a typical Hollywood starlet living in a modest apartment with two other RKO actresses, Vaughn Lester and Myrna Dell, all of which was untrue, as she was in fact still living with her family. Also on December 4, 1945, Jane legally changed her name to Jane Greer through a court in Los Angeles. She told reporters that her former name didn't suit her anymore. She said, "Mine is a sissy name. It's too bo-peepish, ingenue-ish for the type of role I've been playing. It's like Mary Lou or Mary Ann." In 1946, RKO executive producer Sid Rogel decided to assign Jane to several larger roles that were similar to her previous parts. Jane auditioned for a film starring George Raft called Nocturne, but the tough guy actor wanted a well-known name for the role and did not even review her screen test. As a result, the part went to Lynn Barry. However, Jane did appear in The Falcon's Alibi, which was the 12th film in RKO's popular detective series. Critics were largely indifferent to this B picture, with one reviewer rather bluntly stating, "We can do nothing this morning but give the Rialto's latest offering, the bird." On the other hand, Variety praised Jane's performance as Lola Carpenter in The Falcon's Alibi, writing, "Femme honors go to Jane Greer, nittery cannery in one of the victims. Miss Greer wraps up 2 pop songs in fine style, and registers strongly on acting and in dramatic scenes with Alicia Cook Jr." While Jane had not yet refined her appearance to its peak, she was not your typical 1940s tough cookie actress. This was clear when she dazzled in her sequined black gown. She got plenty of attention as she belted out her songs and delivered her lines with confidence. Next up, the Bamboo Blonde was singer Frances Langford's return to film after entertaining troops during World War II. Unfortunately, the film was not a fitting tribute to her, nor did it really show the caliber of work director Anthony Mann would later produce in Hollywood. The plot followed Langford as a mediocre club performer who becomes famous when a B-29 pilot, Russell Wade, has her likeness painted on the side of his bomber. The film's eponymous Bamboo Blonde, Jane had the less than glamorous role of Wade's jealous ex-fiancé. Sunset Pass allowed audiences another fleeting glimpse of Jane. However, Jane's brief appearance as Helen, a dance hall girl at the Lone Pine Saloon, was puzzling to audiences since she had already moved on to bigger roles by this time. Jane explained, "Sunset Pass was done in 1945, just after 2 O'Clock Courage. I was literally hysterical in the part, not realizing I had the flu with a 102-degree temperature. I ruined more takes laughing at myself. They took me off the picture." RKO had undergone upheaval in 1946, when Charles Conner passed away and Dory Sherry took over as executive vice president of production. But Jane's career continued to rise, along with her salary, which increased to $750 a week in 1947. However, her role in Sinbad the Sailor hardly reflected this upward trajectory. The film starred Douglas Fairbanks Jr. in his first project after World War II, and Maureen O'Hara, who was still involved in her acting deal with RKO and 20th Century Fox. The colorful swashbuckler was said to have cost between $3 to $4 million, but it showed many signs of cost-cutting, such as lengthy voiceover exposition and the overuse of miniature effects for its so-called spectacular moments. Jane played the role of Peruse, O'Hara's loyal handmaiden, and she wore a costume featuring a pantaloon bra ensemble with a bare midriff, a daring look for the era. For many actors, a particular role often marks a turning point in their careers, either propelling them to fame or confirming their status as supporting players. Jane's big opportunity arrived with They Won't Believe Me. In her previous 8 films for RKO, she had often been typecast as the bad girl. However, in this melodrama, directed by Irving Pichel, she received a more sympathetic and substantial role. Jane explained the important change she made which led to her gaining better roles. "Baddie roles I attribute to my dark hair. When I lightened it, my face softened, and They Won't Believe Me came along." They Won't Believe Me unfolds in a courtroom where Robert Young stands trial for murder. He is a heartless playboy married to a wealthy Rita Johnson, but he's also entangled with a magazine writer played by Jane. An edgy and dark film with a fantastic plot twist, the entire cast impressed critics, including Jane. The RKO executives clearly took notice, as Jane was promoted to star billing, positioned 3rd above the film's title. After 5 years in Hollywood, she was undoubtedly on the rise. The positive response to They Won't Believe Me resulted in several changes for Jane. Her dressing room at RKO was moved from the top floor to the first, which included a private shower. Next, she was included in the leading role opposite Robert Mitchum in Out of the Past. This was a major role for Jane, as the dreamy-eyed Mitchum was quickly becoming one of Hollywood's biggest stars in the post-war era. Under the careful direction of Jacques Tourneur and the innovative cinematography of Nicholas Musuraca, Out of the Past stood out from typical hard-boiled private eye films filled with shady characters. Wanda Hale of the New York Daily News noted, "Morbid curiosity in the fate of these intriguing people is the film's holding power." Jane Greer's first scene alongside Mitchum was the iconic beach kissing moment. She recalled noticing something unusual on Mitchum's lips and gathered the courage to bring it up. "Excuse me, Bob, but they've done something with your makeup. I think they messed it up. Your lips, that brown lip liner or whatever it is smeared," she said. Mitchum, looking puzzled, called for the makeup artist and asked for a mirror. What he said next must have left Greer feeling both amused and somewhat nauseated. He takes a look into the mirror, Greer recounted, and he says, "Oh honey, that's just chowin' tobacco." Mitchum then casually wiped his mouth and returned to his mark, ready for the kiss. Greer explained that she then just said to herself, "Well, this movie is going to be different." Little did she know just how different it would actually be. Jane also observed that Mitchum's calm presence on screen matched his laid-back demeanor off-camera. In fact, she was led to believe he arrived on set completely unprepared and somehow delivered a more natural performance without knowing the lines. She recalled him asking the script supervisor, "What are the lyrics?" and then admitting to her in a whisper, "I never know the lyrics." Jane believed Mitchum had revealed the secret to better acting, so she decided to ask him outright. When she asked Mitchum if he didn't learn his lines ahead of time, he casually replied, "Nah." This was astonishing to Jane, as Greer typically memorized her lines a week in advance. So she decided to mirror Mitchum's approach to improve her acting. She started memorizing her lines during hair and makeup, just hours before filming began, hoping it would make her appear more thoughtful on screen. However, when the cameras rolled, she needed multiple takes, while Mitchum effortlessly delivered his lines. Eventually, she realized Mitchum had been teasing her the whole time. He always perfectly memorized his lines well in advance. Fortunately, he was quite the gentleman when he was not playing pranks. One example was an incident where the wardrobe department dressed her in an incomplete outfit. They left the back of her dress unfinished since they only planned to film her front side. Not only was this uncomfortable, it was uncomfortably revealing. Being a young actress eager to make her mark, she didn't want to complain, saying, "I was just happy to be in a movie." However, this lazy mistreatment infuriated Mitchum. He barked at the wardrobe department on her behalf, shouting, "This is the leading lady of the film. Take this dress and don't come back until it's finished." Greer also shared her thoughts about working with Kirk Douglas. To say he was less gentlemanly than Mitchum would be an understatement. "He bruised my arms grabbing me," she recalled from a scene they filmed together, "and my face was roundly slapped. How he did champion without maiming his partner is a miracle." Despite half-finished dresses and bruises, Out of the Past became Greer's ticket to superstardom and solidified her status as a noir film legend. In its own way, Out of the Past became for Jane what Double Indemnity was for Barbara Stanwyck. Dory Sherry was enthusiastic about Jane's performance and agreed to increase her contract from $750 a week to $1,000 a week. With her newfound status, Jane made one of the most important purchases a Hollywood star could make, a mansion. She bought a home at 136 South Carmelina Avenue in Brentwood, California, where she lived until 1967. During this time, she had some rather well-known neighbors, including Marilyn Monroe and William Powell. Things were looking good for her, albeit with some limitations. Had Barbara Bel Geddes and Gloria Graham not been grabbing the roles that a more versatile Jane could have easily filled, her impact at RKO and with the public would have been far greater and more enduring. This peak, however, would sadly not be matched again, as that same sinister hand was still working its power against her in the background. At this pivotal point in Jane's career, she decided to marry again. On August 21st, she married wealthy attorney and producer Edward Lasker, who was an associate of Walter Wanger. She had first met him in New York in 1945. After their honeymoon, she was ready for her next role. Jane was not director Sidney Landfield's initial choice for the role of the Saloon Queen in 1948's Station West. He originally wanted Marlene Dietrich to portray Charlie, the gaming house hostess who secretly leads a gang that robs gold from shippers in this 1880s Western mining town. Landfield consistently made Jane feel like a poor substitute for Dietrich, which created a tense atmosphere on set. Since I was 22 at that time, I was quite defenseless, Jane recalled. Dory Sherry came to my rescue and threatened to remove Mr. Landfield if such insults continued. Dory became a good friend of mine socially. Stars Jane, Dick Powell, and Agnes Moorehead attended the Chicago premiere of Station West at the RKO Palace Theater on October 19, 1948. They joined in a local parade and promoted the film during a special radio broadcast. Before Station West even made its national debut, Jane gave birth to her first child, Albert, who was born on June 23, 1948. Meanwhile, RKO was about to undergo another management change. Jane must have been unable to believe her ears when she heard who had just spent a fortune buying out the studio: Howard Hughes. Naturally, in purchasing RKO, he also now owned Jane's contract. By this time, his jealousy had reached a boiling point due to her marriage to Lasker. Hughes's sole aim appeared to be owning her and sabotaging her entire career. He said to me, "While you are under contract to me, you will never work," Greer recalled in a later interview. And I said, "But that will be the end of my career." And he said, "I guess it will, won't it?" To Jane's dismay, Hughes stuck to his word. As long as she remained at RKO, he refused to give her a role. Just as her career seemed poised to propel her to stardom alongside stars like Ava Gardner, everything came to a halt. Then Hughes took it a step further by trying to not only isolate her, but actively undermine her. In 1949, it might have seemed that Hughes was finally easing his grudge against Greer by offering her the lead role in The Big Steal. However, it turned out not to be the favor Jane had hoped for. Hughes was concerned that the public might have turned against the male lead, her former co-star Robert Mitchum, after he was hit with a 50-day jail sentence for marijuana possession. Hughes and RKO were extremely strict about potential communists in the studio, and smoking cannabis was seen by many at the time as inimitably tied to radical politics. Mitchum's reputation was not only tarnished by the public knowledge of his drug use, but now the suspicion that he was secretly tied to communism. However, Hughes and David O. Selznick, who had Mitchum under a lucrative contract, were not about to abandon their valuable male lead during a crisis. Once Mitchum was released on bail, he was quickly brought to the RKO soundstages to start filming The Big Steal. By then, Elizabeth Scott had dropped out of the project, so Hughes called up Jane a week later and offered her the part. The idea was to try and rub some of the tarnish off onto Mitchum's disposable co-star. Hughes would work to diminish any damaging comments about Mitchum, while also redirecting them towards Greer. Greer was eager to return to work, but she was hiding her own secret. She was pregnant with her second child from her marriage to Lasker. To conceal her pregnancy, she took pills for morning sickness, hoping to finish filming before her condition became noticeable. However, she almost got caught. While on the set of The Big Steal, co-star William Bendix noticed her taking pills and inquired about them. Thinking quickly, Greer claimed they were for, as she put it, Montezuma's revenge. Bendix was intrigued and asked if he could have some. Still wanting to keep her pregnancy a secret, Greer agreed. Ironically, Bendix later thanked her for the pills, saying they made him feel great. Bosley Crowther from the New York Times described Jane's performance as prettily played, while Howard Barnes from the New York Herald Tribune noted, "She plays with a cool detachment that is perfectly in key with a bang-bang south-of-the-border melodrama." On October 7, 1949, Jane welcomed her second child, Lawrence. That year, she also took time to lead the GI gift lift for the Los Angeles Junior Chamber of Commerce, which provided Christmas gifts for United Nations soldiers in Korea. But her acting career was stalling under Hughes. She demanded better roles in the studio's dwindling lineup of films. She had big ambitions. She wanted most of all to win an Oscar. "I know it means hard work and a great deal of trying and trying again, but I'm sticking to my guns. If I don't win as a leading lady, I'll keep plugging and win it for a character portrayal. In any case, I want one of those Oscars to show my children." RKO briefly appeased her by discussing a comedy called The Richest Girl in Jail by Michael Fezier, in which she would play a quirky heiress who gets into trouble with the law repeatedly. But that project did not materialize, and Jane found herself in a supporting role to Elizabeth Scott in The Company She Speaks, which did little to help her chances of staying afloat in Hollywood, let alone win her a Best Supporting Actor nomination. By 1951, RKO's production levels had bottomed out, and the Hughes era at the studio was turning into a disaster as the industry evolved around them. Hughes was eager to recover some of the costs by loaning out actors and technical staff to other studios. Jane was loaned to 20th Century Fox for 2 films. One of those films, You're in the Navy Now, turned out to be a lackluster comedy that probably looked better on paper than it did on screen. The pairing of box office star Gary Cooper and skilled director Henry Hathaway seemed like a winning combination. However, audiences were not amused by the flimsy story. Jane appeared on screen briefly as Cooper's understanding wife. The film generated such a poor box office response that it was quickly withdrawn, retitled You're in the Navy Now, and re-released. But it still only achieved modest results. She had grown tired of the stagnant routine at RKO and the generic roles she was being offered. I didn't want my sons to have to grow up and when someone asked what their mother did, to have to reply, "Oh, Mom's a gun mole," she explained. To help her escape her contract, her husband, Edward Lasker, managed to negotiate a settlement with Hughes. With support from her longtime friend Dory Sherry, who is now leading production at MGM, Jane signed a short-term contract with the studio. However, MGM had long since departed from its golden age and was struggling to compete with the rise of television. The management under Sherry was questionable, and Jane, like many other actors at MGM, found herself floundering in the large studio system as it buckled under its own weight and the rise of actor power in the 1950s. 1952's You for Me was a lighthearted screwball comedy produced by MGM's budget unit, but that was part of the problem. It was too simple and lacked the strength to stand out on its own. The film was released as an unremarkable double feature marketed at a teenage audience, even though its premise was of more interest to an adult crowd. Not many hip teens of the early 50s were going to the movies to see cheap screwball comedies anymore. MGM's promotional material for You for Me described Jane's character as a little bit of Eve, a little bit of Delilah, and a gal who just can't say no. Unfortunately, not enough discerning audiences viewed this film to make any impression on studio executives. Her next project shifted her to the Technicolor swashbuckler, The Prisoner of Zenda, where she played Antoinette de Malbum, the fifth billed character. She looked stunning in her role, as, quote, the beautiful conspirator who lures men to doom. The remake paled in comparison to the original in most people's view. When actress Betsy Drake turned down a co-starring role in MGM's budget film, Desperate Search, Jane was thrown in at the last minute to replace her. This change showed just how little influence Jane and her agent, the famous artist agency, had with the studio executives. Her frustration was boiling over, and she began to make more headlines for her candid and sharp opinions than for her role on screen. In one interview, she shared her thoughts with columnist Earl Wilson. She said, "Hollywood's biggest mistake is trying to make everybody believe the stars are like the girl next door. Now that's silly. If they were like the girl next door, nobody'd ever go to the movies. They'd go next door to see the girl next door." That same year, Jane wrote a piece for King Features titled, How to Get Rid of a Man. Among her various amusing suggestions, she included a rather extreme option, dropping dead. Jane's last project with MGM came in 1953 with The Clown, starring Red Skelton. This film was a weak remake of the 1931 classic, The Champ, which featured Wallace Beery and Jackie Cooper. The movie struggled to evoke any of the emotional power of The Champ and was another washed-up role. The following one had some potential, but a feud between director Edmund Goulding and studio head Darryl F. Zanuck led Goulding to sabotage Down Among the Sheltering Palms as a form of retaliation against Zanuck. And so Down Among the Sheltering Palms went down itself, along with Jane's role, another she was parachuted into after Jane Haver had a last-minute moral panic about certain themes in the film. At least that's the excuse Haver gave, although she may have merely smelled the turkey it would turn out to be at an early stage. Jane felt increasingly unhappy during her year at MGM. It was meant to be a rebirth, but in fact it was just as stagnant as her time at RKO. She was offered and turned down numerous mediocre roles. In silence, she negotiated her release from Metro and stepped away from acting for 3 years. During this period, she welcomed her third son, Stephen, who was born on Mother's Day, May 9, 1954, at Cedars of Lebanon Hospital. When she finally returned to filmmaking, it was as a freelance actress in United Artists' Run for the Sun, produced by Jane Russell's husband, Robert Waterfield. When asked what inspired her return to the screen, Jane explained, "I like the role of being a mother and a wife very much, but it got to be sort of monotonous. But more importantly, I began thinking of myself as a typical drab housewife. I decided to do something about it, and here I am." In Run for the Sun, Jane played the third-billed character, Katie Connors, and she gave one of her finest performances. She portrayed a savvy magazine writer sent to Mexico to uncover why adventurer and writer Richard Widmark had abruptly stopped producing his work. She tracks him down in his secluded hideaway and learns the painful truth. After losing his wife, he replaced his ambition with alcohol, and he left his writing talent to stagnate. Although he sees himself as a lost cause, he still possesses enough gentlemanly charm to offer Jane a flight back to Mexico City in his small plane. During the flight, a magnetized notebook in her bag disrupts the plane's compass, causing it to crash in the jungle. They soon find themselves at the mercy of a Nazi war criminal, played by Peter Van Eyck, and his sadistic henchmen, who see them as perfect prey for a thrilling manhunt. This storyline might sound familiar. Richard Connell's story, The Most Dangerous Game, had been adapted at least twice before. First in 1932 with Joel McCrea, and again in 1946 as Game of Death with John Loder. There was nothing original about Run for the Sun, but it was a vast improvement on the caliber of films she was making before her hiatus. However, just when it seemed things were about to get back on track for Jane, the curse that hung over her career reared its head once again. Jane contracted a serious tropical virus while filming on location, and to make matters worse, she fractured her coccyx on a rock during swamp scenes. While she had finally escaped the clutches of Hughes, the effects of the virus began to take a toll on her health, which would have a major effect later in her life. In 1957, Jane landed another decent role. Man of a Thousand Faces featured James Cagney in a loosely adapted version of Lon Chaney's life story. Cagney personally requested Jane to play the role of the second Mrs. Cheney, a former showgirl. However, Jane's character was somewhat underdeveloped, leaving her with little to work with. As a result, The New Yorker described her as pretty enough, but about as appetizing as a cake of soap. Still, the film was popular, and Universal put a heavy budget behind its marketing and distribution, all of which ought to have reignited interest in Jane, but the interest would never come. Greer's film career never truly recovered from Hughes's vendetta. Her movie opportunities were always limited, as even if Hughes didn't directly intervene to stop her being cast, fellow studio execs were loath to annoy another one of their own, especially a man as powerful as Hughes. So she was always a risk to studios. With that in mind, she decided to turn her back on the movies and try out the exciting new medium, television. TV was beginning to take hold of the American public, but her transition would not be smooth. Despite her tough and resilient image on screen, Jane had moments of fear when it came to working in TV. She was particularly anxious about performing in front of live audiences, and never considered acting in stage plays. Her one experience with radio was particularly scary for her. While at RKO, she was cast alongside Tyrone Power and David Niven in a radio adaptation of The Bishop's Wife for Lux Radio Theater in 1949. Jane remembered how terrifying that experience was. My pages shook, so they pasted each page of my script to cardboard. The script was then about 3 feet high on the stage beside me. I would grab a hunk of pages from the pile, very funny sight to the audience. Jane found television to be at least less intimidating than live radio. The process resembled making movies, but with fewer complications. She made her small screen debut on Ford Theater in the episode titled Look for Tomorrow on NBC on May 15, 1953. She played a young singer in love with her voice coach, portrayed by William Ching. After this, Jane returned to television that fall in an episode of Mirror Theater called Summer Dance. Soon enough, a familiar pattern to her career would emerge. Jane often found herself underutilized in various Western series. As before, she gave solid performances that did little to advance her now sporadic career. Occasionally, she took on more interesting roles, such as in Portrait Without a Face, on Thriller in 1961. Though the show itself was of low quality, resembling a melodrama from the 1940s, Jane played the widow of a murdered painter. Her last television appearance was a brief cameo on the detective series Burke's Law in 1964. If there was a challenging year for Jane, it was certainly 1963. She and Edward Lasker finalized their divorce on November 6th in Juarez, Mexico. Just after this, she received devastating news about her health. Her heart had been seriously damaged by the virus she contracted while filming Run for the Sun. The only option was surgery, and she underwent a heart operation. To help her regain her footing in the industry, Frank London, the casting director for Edward Dmytryk, recommended her for a part in Where Love Has Gone. Jane looked back on this opportunity, saying, "Although I was terribly weak and underweight, the experience was good for me, and I am grateful for the chance." Her gratitude for London blossomed into a romantic relationship, and they soon fell in love. Where Love Has Gone was based on Harold Robbins' sensational novel, which loosely depicted the scandalous story surrounding the Lana Turner, Cheryl Crane, and Johnny Stompanato love-homicide triangle. Now, if you want to hear all about that incredible, dark, and twisted story, well, we have a two-part special all about Lana Turner's life, with part 2 mainly focused on the dramatic events surrounding her relationship with Stompanato and the infamous trial of the century. Links are in the description and on screen now. Despite the strong performances from Bette Davis as the overbearing matriarch and Susan Hayward as her troubled artist daughter, the film suffered from John Michael Hayes' script, which was criticized for making every dramatic line feel like a caption for a New Yorker cartoon. Judith Crist of the New York Herald Tribune found herself torn, unable to, quote, decide whether to laugh or throw up. Jane appeared fifth billed as Marion Spicer, a supportive juvenile probation officer for Joey Heatherton's character, Hayward's sexually curious teenager. Jane's limited scenes and dialogue went largely unnoticed by audiences. However, Variety kindly noted that she was beautiful and excellent. It would be a fair assessment of her career in some respects, always beautiful and very often excellent, and yet seemingly unnoticed by audiences and invisible to studios. In 1965, when producer-actor Peter Lawford adapted his moderately successful Broadway domestic comedy, Time Out for Ginger, into the musical film Billy, he cast Jane as the wife of Jim Backus and the mother of tomboy Patty Duke. It was a small high, and after a career filled with disappointments, Jane realized it might be a good moment to bring down the curtain on her life as an actress after this enjoyable role. Jane chose to step back from acting and focused on being a mother. She married Frank London in 1967 and effectively left Hollywood behind, feeling her career had not fulfilled its potential. She expressed little desire to revive her acting career, saying, "It was great fun and satisfaction in my youth. I have no ambitions now, no regrets." Nevertheless, she still attended film screenings at the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences in Hollywood. Jane said that her interest in films remained strong, and she was impressed with the creative freedoms that were being given to the new Hollywood directors. She said, "It is a very exciting time for films. Much more can be shown of reality than in former years." Until March 1973, Jane had been viewed by the film industry as somewhat retired. Then, unexpectedly, she agreed to take a role in MGM's The Outfit, produced by Carter DeHaven Jr., and featuring stars like Robert Duvall, Karen Black, and Joe Don Baker. Jane maintained a clear perspective on her career, life, and the world around her. She casually informed the press that her latest role was not a comeback, but simply a return to her professional duties. In a note to the author regarding her recent casting, Jane expressed her genuine delight in being back in front of the cameras. Finally, she was set to gain the appreciation she deserved, and it would come in the later years of her life, a period when she could no longer rely on her youth and beauty, but would have to impress with the power of her performances. So it was that Jane enjoyed a resurgence in her career during the 1980s. She appeared in Against All Odds, a 1984 remake of Out of the Past, starring Jeff Bridges. Also, Jane had a 6-episode role on a primetime soap opera, Falcon Crest, and appeared in 3 episodes of David Lynch's television series, Twin Peaks, where she took on the role of food critic Vivian Smythe Niles. True to her noir film legacy, Jane settled into retirement in Bel Air, Los Angeles. After the passing of Frank in 2001, she sensed that her own time was now limited. Sadly, she passed away just months later from cancer. In her later interviews, it seemed that Jane had come to terms with Howard Hughes and his vendetta that had stifled her career before it could truly flourish. In an interview with Skippy Lowe, she acknowledged that Hughes could be ruthless. However, she also made it clear that, as a man, she liked him. Elegant, graceful, and devastatingly beautiful, Jane starred in nearly 30 major films in her career. Many were beneath her talents, but fans of film noir are well aware to this day of the impact she made on that genre. The post-war Western world was one of suspicion and doubt, as well as one of a strangely lost beauty, and few actresses better embodied this complex mood than Jane Greer. Out of the Past in particular is one of the genre's masterpieces, and in the film her character, Kathy Moffat, is described as being like an autumn leaf blowing from gutter to gutter. Much the same could be said of her career path after this film, but there were many other highlights. She never won her Oscar, and in fact The Guardian listed her as one of the greatest actors to never win one back in 2009. But she will always be remembered as long as there's an interest in the thrilling movies that came to be called film noir and their femme fatales. That's about all for this episode. Please subscribe if you made it to the end of the video. Almost 80% of our regular viewers aren't subscribed yet, and we'd love to have you on board, especially for our polls on the community page. Otherwise, if you want more Hollywood Mysteries content, why not check out the members area on YouTube or our Patreon? Links are in the description. That's all from me. Sweet dreams.